Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Today we're taking on a huge, massive topic, and it's not like we haven't done it before, but it just seems to be the discussion everywhere. Free speech and censorship. I think it may have to do with the fact that we're in the middle of a couple of political campaigns. We have the Vice President of the United States threatening to shut down X. We've actually seen Elon Musk silenced by the Brazilian government, Western governments everywhere, the UK, across Europe, Australia, and particularly the United States, and of course here in Canada, have legislation to restrict free speech and to create censorship in a variety of different forms. And that is a word that some people disagree with, but I have no other way to describe it but that. Matt Taibbi, one of the journalists online who writes about this issue constantly, actually said this week, I'm just going to quote it here, we're at a DEFCON 4 or 5 moment as Western governments tighten their control over online speech. So we have gone today to search out Dr. Emily Laidlaw. She is a Canadian Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law, Associate Professor at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Law, author of a book called Regulating Speech in Cyberspace, Gatekeepers, Human Rights, and Corporate Responsibility. So that's what she looks at: platforms, regulation, online harms, privacy, freedom expression, etc. It's a big, long list. Welcome, Emily. I will call you that if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Senator.
So, well, you can call me Pamela. So you'll get your Dr. Laidlaw reference only because you also got recognition in the province of Saskatchewan for your legal work. So that's a big deal in my world. Let us just start. When somebody says that we're at DEFCON 4, DEFCON 5 when it comes to constraint, limiting free speech, talking of censorship, are you getting that same sense that somehow we've hit a moment in time here?
We're absolutely at a moment in time. I would reframe it, though. I would say that it's, freedom of expression is on the hot seat right now.
Mm-hmm.
But there's all kinds of things on the hot seat. So it's not just that freedom of expression is at risk. It is that the social conditions of freedom of expression have changed. And so there is massive change in all kinds of jurisdictions to try to come up with laws that are sensitive and appropriate to promoting and protecting free expression, but also deal with some of the major online harms and different issues that we need to address. They're hard to write, though.
We have been going through this, studying these bills, C10, then C11, C18, Bill 63. Governments seem to be very clumsy at this because it's hard for them to separate their own partisan political interests from what the public is demanding is some kind of regulatory regime so that there are some kind of controls, as opposed to those of us that are just free speechers, period. But there are a lot of concerns about the kind of access that people have to material online.
Well, and I would say that everyone has a right to feel that they have a stake in this debate. And I have worked for decades at this point in this particular corner of the world.
Yeah.
And I care about it from a legal and a policy perspective. And it is hard to watch the issues at times get polarized, because I think that distracts us from the really hard work that we need to do to write good laws in this area. There's been good and bad about some of the laws that have been introduced. I do think that Part 1 of Bill C-63 was the subject of quite extensive consultation. So I'd say it stands out compared to some of the other bills that have been introduced. Part 1 is the proposal to create a digital safety commission, etc.
Yeah, so that existed in the States too, I think, under Obama. So let's just remind people, because I know it's been the summer and everybody is trying to put a lot of this stuff out of their head, but there's been long discussions in this country over Bill C-18, the Online News Act, which really created some consternation. The rules for how the companies should operate and to whom they were actually beholden. We had Online Streaming Act, Bill C-11, which gave the CRTC authority over all audio and video content, and the government insisted that they weren't trying to regulate user-generated content, but everything since has indicated that they've set the CRTC about regulating user-generated content. And then the bill you refer to. So is Bill 63, is this what concerns you most about where we're headed, or is it the moment in which we're actually going to hash this stuff out?
Well, Bill C-63 deals with a very narrow part of this universe, but I'd say it's the core aspect, which is
okay, explain. Yeah.
Okay, so let me pull it back for a second and say, probably the most important growth we've seen in the digital economy is the growth of these platforms. And it's all the major tech companies, right? And they've consolidated enormous power and created new industries. And if we've seen the development of AI, power and ownership is being consolidated with the same companies. And what it requires then is some sort of kind of attention to say, what is the impact that you're having on the economy? What's the impact you're having on society? Maybe we need special consumer protection regulations to address what your role is. So all the different bills aside, enter Bill C-63 to deal with one dimension of it, which is a lot of these platforms, the social media providers, provide spaces where a whole lot of harm happens. Should they have separate responsibilities about, say, designing their spaces to be safe? That's solely the question with at least, and again, I'll say part one. I mean, I think we'll have a lot to discuss about parts 2 and 3, but that was the focus of that. And we need to take a look at that. This is a consumer protection question, but it is a major free expression question, because no matter how you look, these private companies are, if you don't regulate, we're still being regulated because they're making decisions about the rules for using that space. They are creating value systems.
And the algorithms are making decisions. Yeah.
It is. And that's the two sides, which is what speech are they okay with? Yeah. What is their content moderation system? But also they have their own impact because the algorithms push certain content. Are they promoting some things, demoting it? How do they make those decisions? So it's a difficult issue because it's both consumer protection and a free expression issue all at the same time. But it's not something that we can just get by with relying on existing law, because we don't have, for the most part, law to address this. And other jurisdictions similar to ours are decades ahead of us in this. Some of them are on second generation laws while we haven't passed one.
Okay, I want to come back to that instantly, but I want to put this in the context of what we heard in the last week from Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, where, having denied this in front of congressional hearings and to every journalistic outfit in the country, he finally conceded that in the run-up to the 2020 election in the U.S., he was pressured by the White House, by government officials, to censor some material that would have been problematic for the government, whether it was Hunter Biden's laptop or discussions about, election interference and who was talking about, what and generating what stories, that he complied with that, as his colleagues have. And it goes to that fundamental question for me of trust, because the whole business of journalism, the whole business of however we exchange information with one another, you and I having a conversation, is based on trust. I've got to believe that because you've written this book and you are at the university that you know what you're talking about. And you've got to believe, because I'm a senator sitting on these committees studying these bills, that I know some. And when that trust breaks down, then when somebody starts talking about regulating, whoever it is, whether it's the companies themselves or governments around it, it becomes a huge issue. So we're having that discussion in this context today.
No, and that's a great example you gave because, you know, let me complicate it even further,
Yeah.
right? We should all be extraordinarily concerned about the idea that government is using its power to softly push for certain results from private companies.
Right.
We should all scrutinize that, right? Where it gets complicated too is that there's sometimes legitimate reasons to have conversations. So, for example, there might be certain national security risks that, I mean, there's not a classification issue with sharing the information, but they want to prepare platforms so that they can, say, alert their crisis response teams and get ready to deal with some major issues that's to the benefit of everyone. We don't want to shut down generally that avenue, but that soft approach would be shut down by the idea that government can't have that conversation. But the idea of soft pressure on companies to do kind of regulate what we might view as lawful but maybe problematic expression should concern us all. And the reason why I'm for some sort of regulation is that we need to take it away from private companies, which have the power to just set whatever they want. And we saw with Elon Musk take over of X. He just changed the entire approach to trust and safety at a whim. But equally, what we don't want is for the government to have the power to make decisions about content removal. So we need some sort of independent body. And one of the things we can get into is why courts are not the appropriate place as a first stop to deal with many of these issues.
Well, I think that's what everybody's looking for now, is some kind of, I don't know if there's such a thing, but more objective arbiter, because, the very case of the Zuckerberg case was the government seeking reelection, or the Democrats in the US in this case seeking reelection, warning them that there was a lot of disinformation coming and it was from Russia. And that, then the story about Hunter Biden's laptop was looked at in that context, over and above algorithms, a company making that decision. So you don't want the company making it, but when governments are totally using this power for their own purposes, it's also really troubling.
I know, both are troubling, aren't they? And it's unrealistic, the idea that you create a tribunal that could make content decisions.
Right.
So we are, for the most part, relying on the private companies to self-govern. And there's some good with that because they can innovate solutions, and some have. But what we need is minimum standards. And what we need is not accountability of each individual piece of content. What we need is oversight about the overall system, right? Do they have different safety measures in place to address issues? Yeah. And I will say, let's get into the systemic stuff, but I do want to make a point about content that we should always err on the side of interpretive generosity, where if we're talking about content in the gray area, you err on the side of freedom of expression. We always have. It's a fundamental right. It's a foundational right on which so many other things are built. And so
all the rest of the freedoms,
all the rest of the freedoms. But we have to think clearly about, in understanding interpretive generosity and saying we should allow as much information as possible to circulate and have faith that the public can handle it. We do have to have an eye to what is that line? Where is the threshold? How can we address these different types of harm that I think all of us would agree are bad? It's just more a conversation about what's a good solution to this that's as proportionate as possible.
So how do we look at that? So Twitter, or X now, and other sites, it's just like whatever goes. If you don't like, it's out there. If you don't want to read it, don't read it. Don't like it. Don't, just it's a platform and it's there. We have other specific areas though, which I think you were trying to get at with Bill 63. I mean, we've got a lot of gruesome pornography and violence online, and we don't want 7-year-olds looking at that. So, how do we make a distinction between just it's an open game over here on X or whatever platform, and then saying, but there are parts of that we need to control, monitor, and have a system for? How do we even begin that approach?
Oh, yes. And I think that I would say that Bill C-63 does go some ways towards that. Absolutely, we can have conversations about things to tweak, and I do have a few things I think are crucial to tweak. What I would say is, each type of harm has different dynamics, and we have to think about differently. And as you said, there's the most gruesome, right? Yeah. So child protection measures, when we're talking about child sexual exploitation material, and again, a lot of this now is an AI generated child exploitation material, often of sometimes survivors of abuse, or, creating a video of the kid next door. It's horrific material, sextortion. Very clearly, we can justify stronger obligations on companies to deal with this type of material. And the other would be the crime of sharing of intimate images without consent. Right? All of these are crimes. And so the only obligation under Bill C-63 is to remove that type of content. And even then it is take it down, pause, assess it, allow parties to make, statements, representations.
Right.
There's a process for that, because we can all get around our minds around that one. That's an easy one in some ways, that we can say it's bad, let's take it down. Where we get into the more difficult territory is speech that is hate speech, terrorist, I'd say what might be framed as terrorist propaganda, and for some crossover into political expression. And the spectrum of expression in that territory that is hateful and leads to physical risks. We've seen this with some brutal events of property and attacks on individuals. That is more difficult and contextual. So how do we handle that?
Well, this is like, we're right in the middle of this, and we've seen university, presidents lose their job. We're all watching what's being said on the streets and online in this country about the Jewish population. In any other context, it would be, in my mind, and you please correct me, it's pretty clearly hate speech if you say, all Jews should be killed. We should kill all Jews. We hate all Jews. To me, that's, if you start to use secondary language like from the river to the sea, then that's more open to interpretation. But are you talking about that stuff as well, that this is going to be captured somehow?
Well, and that's a great example, because at a content level where each individual piece would come up, no. The Digital Safety Commission would be there to investigate companies to say, you have a safety plan. Are you living up to it? Are you being transparent about what you do? At a broad level, is there a problem here? Which is very different than, say, some regulator being able to make some order for content removal, which there'd be, and some might be disappointed. There'd be no power for the regulator to order removal of hate speech, specific content when it comes, that might be anti-Semitic hate speech, or as we're seeing, hate speech against Palestinians. I mean, there's a wide variety of it. But what I want to note here is that the companies are still dealing with decisions about handle specific content. My understanding is Meta's oversight board is already looking at how do I address from the river to the sea. And I'd say that lands in that category of interpretive generosity, where, You say, look, there's different interpretations of this. Some, it's extremely harmful for some. It's used in a way that is hateful by some. And for others, it's not. It has a different sense of freedom and identity. And it's all of those things. In that situation, then that doesn't rise to the level of hate speech. But the way that the legislation is written, we have to set the threshold high. So it's looking at a very clear definition set down by the Supreme Court. I have read many criticisms that the language is a bit woolly, that vilification and detestation could be subjectively interpreted. I would say, and I would invite anyone listening to go back and read the Supreme Court of Canada cases. They actually detail and they provide quite a bit of detail about how high the threshold is to be hate speech. So
I think that was I was looking back at the decision. This is 2021. And we forget these basics. And I think this was a 5-4 split on this one. But, expression in the nature of rude remarks does not constitute discrimination. Being offended, I'm now freelancing here, but being offended by something you said does not constitute, a violation of your free speech rights or my free. Like we're having trouble with even the large concept, as you say, erring in the favor of a more generous interpretation. But we haven't even figured out if the Supreme Court is ruling 5-4 on free speech.
Well, and I think that split I'm finding a common occurrence in my area. Every Section 8 privacy case right now is a split judgment the same way. I think that the one consistent we see out of the Supreme Court is a deep commitment to the right to freedom of expression. Yeah. And where they do struggle is where we're all struggling right now is what do you do when we know that there's harm? So if we're supposed to err on the side of generosity and allow expression to circulate online, what do we do about the fact that some groups are far more targeted than others, and they're essentially shut out of participating in these spaces because it's so awful for them? Like, it's not the same experience for each of us in these spaces. And to say that they should just, go away and not use those spaces is difficult when nowadays we rely on social media and this type of participation professionally even. And so that's not a good answer. And so there has to be some way through that. And at least a first step is thinking about digital safety plans. Is there, do companies have to take down that content? No. Maybe they flag it. Maybe they, provide, more attention during periods of elections to some of the risks so that there's improved content moderation or complaints mechanisms, things like that. Like, not everything is solved through content removal, nor needs to be.
Right. So then again, it always comes back to who is the arbiter. I mean, who says now we're in election period, because that was exactly the case we were talking about in the US where they convinced the providers, the Metas, the Facebooks, to constrain their content, to censor their content, basically out of fear. Now, you could have said, look, it's perfectly reasonable to say that there will be Russian or Chinese bot activity in the course of an election. We know that. We're seeing it in this country. We're seeing it across the border. Of course, they're going to interfere in our election. But can you judge? Is there a way to actually judge where that content is real or valid versus generated by a bot or some very vested interest that isn't a bot? Like, I don't know what we're asking these companies to do and whether it's even possible to figure out a way to assess that.
Yeah, and I think that the legislation out of the EU, the UK, Australia, and I'd say with Canada's proposal would go towards looking at this. When it comes to bots, I think it's not always easy for companies to identify it, but to the extent they can, it's an easier issue of just saying that there's, you don't have the same free expression issues arising about a bot.
Because you can just take that down. That's a simple one.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
it is relatively simple. I mean, if you talk to the companies, they'd be like, it's not that easy. It's really hard
Yeah.
sometimes, but it is conceptually easier. I think that where it's more difficult here is if we say to a company, you have to file a digital safety plan and you need to tell us that your system has processes in place to deal with hate speech. Then I think where the struggle will be is in figuring out, well, what is the standard? What actually do they need to report? What are the metrics of success? And I think that what we should all kind of embrace here is the fact that that's not going to all be clear at the outset, nor could it ever be. Both the UK and the EU have been developing, after kind of creating a framework through legislation, are creating guidelines. Now, I wouldn't recommend the UK approach. I mean, some of their guidelines are like this 750-page document that.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, they got people on the street protesting. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
It's too much. But if you have the experts who then can work, understanding evolving tech, then they can help develop over time what those standards look like. And it's not like this is unfamiliar. I mean, companies are audited all the time for certain standards and expectations that evolve. But the idea of systemic risk, I mean, the academics out there, all of us, civil society, it absolutely is something that they're trying to work out. I see that as just a necessary part of this project, but it is asking us to take a bit of a leap of faith.
I don't know if this is still the case in Australia, but their approach to date was to ask people to submit ID to access the internet. Do I have that correctly? And then that would in turn, the actual police or whatever body was overseeing this, the policing mechanism, would have to have access to their social media usage to make sure it's that. Like when you look at these cases, you go, how could this possibly work? Like you can ask a company to have a plan in place, like we all do. What do we do if there's a fire? We're all, take the stairs. You don't get in the elevator. That neither prevents the fire or prevents, somebody from risk or harm. And if the building burns down, somebody might lose their life. Like, I don't know how we can have rules in place designed by mere mortals that are going to be able to anticipate all of the issues that are there without so infringing on my right when I'm not doing anything wrong, or any individual who's just accessing the information for entertainment or education, how we make that distinction in terms of motive.
Yes. And I have a good answer for this for you.
Great.
Because it's one of the issues that I thought about quite a bit. I mean, I don't know the specific Australia example.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm 100% right on that, but I did read that.
Yes. And so what I would say is, if operated at its best, this will be an imperfect system. So the whole goal of it is to reduce harmful content, not to get rid of it entirely. That will never happen, because if the goal is to get rid of this content entirely, then that means that we have definitely overstepped and you would be scooping up all kinds of lawful expression. And we can look to the EU that had a notice and takedown regime for all illegal content. It has had that in place since the year 2000. And there has been, some stumbles along the way where it incentivized over removal. And so what is proposed here is actually just related to child sexual abuse material and intimate images. So it's much narrower. So I think it has to be an imperfect system. The other is that means that it's why I don't think this is appropriate as a first step through courts. The whole point of admin agencies, and again, I'm not here advocating for bureaucracy, but this is a huge gap, and we've been waiting for so long to fill it. And it is that, court processes take a long time. They can be, if you're going to sue, it's incredibly expensive. It's only available for a few. It takes years. We don't want to over criminalize expression. So a softer mechanism is actually through an administrative body, and it also can evolve with the tech and respond to it. That said, what matters most then? Who's on this admin agency? Like, what's the makeup of the Digital Safety Commission? I think that one of the most important steps, it's structured to be an independent body, but to keep it independent, I think that an amendment to the bill should be to specify the expertise needed by that commission so that we can at least provide some sort of guardrails to ensure that with different changes in government, it's not just populated with certain like-minded people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say that to you, that I can name you sort of 20 appointments made by government to various, it doesn't matter whether it's the Senate or the CRTC, government of the day chooses like-minded people. And they're the ones that, and this applies to all parties, not just the government of this day, right? It applies to everybody. That, and we've seen it with their boards of directors on funding, the conflicts of interest that we have on the green funding. I mean, there's literally a story a day about this stuff, that people that are appointed to key positions to make key decisions, supposedly with some neutrality and expertise, aren't offering that.
No, and I think that's a fair criticism. And so I'm always solutions oriented. So then I think, well, we can't fully fix the fact that anyone who's got the power of appointment is going to appoint like-minded people. Okay, we understand that. So how can we guard against it to the extent? I mean, one option might be we should have no admin agency. We shouldn't do it that way at all.
So how would you do it if it was let's walk through those options. What if there was no admin agency?
If there's no admin agency at all, we're left where we are right now, which is, you could strengthen resourcing to law enforcement, which we should. I mean, this should happen anyway, to be able to prosecute hate crimes. That only covers a little snippet of what we're talking about here. We are strengthening privacy laws to deal with some aspects of these issues, which could include child protection, but it doesn't actually deal with, there's no actual law in the books that really addresses what is the role of these companies when it comes to allowing this different type of illegal content pass through their services. Right. We have it for defamation and we have a law for copyright. That's it in Canada right now. So
we have laws for hate speech, but they're not widely enforced. Yeah.
And it would only be to prosecute the individuals that posted it, not the company. So it's both important, right? But it's just a different target of the laws. So if we leave it to a court process right now, if an individual doesn't like something posted online, they could sue. Or if it's, a threat, then perhaps the individual who posted it, if they can be identified, will be charged, all appropriate mechanisms. But it falls short of the bigger issue I mentioned at the beginning, which is you've got these gigantic companies that have outsized influence on our world. So perhaps we could pass new consumer protection laws and it's just mediated through the courts. But I don't think courts are well placed to deal with, they could deal with, do they have a duty of care and have they met that standard? But you're still dealing with one-off lawsuits.
And not the detail thereof. I think we can all agree that companies and just as individuals must take responsibility to make sure, I've got to make sure that if I'm surrounded by children, there's not activity going on that is going to negatively impact that in my own home or on the street. We have to have that expectation of people, but to enforce it is quite another matter. Right.
To enforce it is definitely another matter. And so then I turn back to thinking through the administrative agency. And I think that ultimately, our biggest concern here is a faithfulness to the rule of law when it comes to freedom of expression. So that is a key expertise here. I think a broad understanding of the different natures of the harms. I mean, the understanding of what's happening to children online is it's pretty horrific, and you know, it escapes me right now one of the key platforms that was shut down in the States. But it was a platform where basically you connect with strangers through video calls.
Right.
The idea that this existed, that there was actually no real easy, I'd say, accountability by that company to say, do you think maybe that's unsafe? You're not checking anything. I think this might be a problem for these kids, and we can tell parents to watch over it as much as we want, but this is a whole society problem. So I think that pushes us back to this idea of the admin agency, and that you need, I think, people with expertise in law and freedom of expression to begin with. I think you need people with expertise when it comes to child safety. I think that you do need perspectives that reflect marginalized populations. And I think those tend to be the expertise, obviously tech expertise as well. I mean, those are the broad, my wish list, But
so how would you go? Because I mean, the government is at that moment, right? I mean, if with this digital commission, et cetera, the things they're proposing, like somehow they have to assure the public that the overseers of this are reasonable, thoughtful, unconflicted individuals. The track record's not great, as I said, so it's going to be doubly hard to do that in the context where, in my mind, trust has already broken down between Canadian citizens and the media, Canadian citizens and the government, Canadian citizens and many institutions. That's already seriously frayed. So it's a very difficult time to be proposing that somehow this system could be neutral and fair.
Yeah, and I wonder if there will ever be a good time for this particular one. And I think that, a conversation I have with my colleague all the time is we need to be going, town to town, city to city into like a library in Red Deer, Alberta, and having a really open conversation about this is where we're at. These are the choices that you have. What does comfort me that is possible here, that we could rebuild that trust, is that there were 2 commissions on democratic expression. There was the Citizens Assembly, Youth Assembly, and they all kind of came to the same relative conclusion. Some of it was, we've got to take some personal responsibility here.
Yeah, that's exactly,
100%. We don't want to be in an overregulated space, but actually we do need something here, and everyone seemed ready. So I would say that the majority of Canadians generally support the idea of this, and have faith in that. So if I had to focus my attention, it would be, how do you bridge that, build that trust then in an institution, the idea that it's not going to overreach, that it does not even have the power to do that. That's not what it's been built to do. I think one way to do that is the bill doesn't address, I mean, this is getting into the weeds though, so it's hard to translate it, but the bill doesn't address and doesn't obligate companies to protect fundamental rights like freedom of expression. The commission has to. But I'd say the expert panel that advised them had always emphasized you have to have dual obligations. Yeah. If you're going to force a private company to be attentive to certain types of harms, another type of harm is harm to human rights like freedom of expression.
Exactly.
So you have to look at both, and their obligations must be to both. And that is the way to force that balance. It forces the commission to be balanced. It forces the companies to be balanced.
Part of this is really a question of managing expectations, because I think governments tend to overpromise, right? People are outraged because there's an incident of some kind online, or harm comes to a child, and government says that's exactly why we need to regulate this, and we're going ahead with our bill to make sure there's no harm comes to children. But as we've been discussing for the better part of 45 minutes here, it's almost impossible to do that. So we also have to quit promising what can't be delivered and really start to work more on what you've been discussing is that education process all around.
Yes, it's education. And it is also, I mean, I firmly am of the view that we need some regulation, and Canada will be an outlier if we don't move. I mean, we already are an outlier on this front. But that said, we shouldn't overpromise what it can do or what it's supposed to do. And I think it puts us in a difficult position because then you're stuck backtracking and saying, well, that doesn't actually do some of that. Right. And on the other side, then you seem to have failed to deliver when the reality is the only proportionate approach, which actually is, I think, at the core of what we're talking about with that part of Bill C-63 is making things a bit better.
Yeah. Well, at least giving people the other thing that has come up, and this has been very controversial as well, is this is a Senate bill, Bill S-210, and that's also risks doing that, the overreach of that impacts, as you say, other rights, privacy, and the right to many of them. What's your take on that? I mean, everybody wants to protect children. There's no question about that. But
yeah, I think we all agree on the objectives here. I think that age verification technology, I mean, this is the money question in the next decade of how to do this in a way that protects privacy and cybersecurity. A lot of those that push against it generally will say this is against the open ethos of the internet. It's always been global. It's always been, about the free flow of ideas. I think my response to that is, yes, we should be sensitive to that. Of course we should be. The problem is there's all kinds of really awful content on that especially children can access. So the idea that why would we not look into different ways that you could authenticate age or appropriately design it to ensure that children aren't exposed to particular content that they should not see. I think that's... I mean,
honestly, we can't even make parental controls on the TV work.
Yeah.
And the code 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not hard for smart kids to figure it out, right?
Well, they can. And so I would say that, if you've got a kid who really wants to find pornographic material online, they still will, right? Yeah. So this was never going to solve that problem. And again, this is that idea that we need to embrace imperfection here. That, they're going to go use that VPN and get around it. They might steal credentials, whatever it is. But we should be exploring age verification. And there's a lot of organizations and individuals working hard at trying to do this in a way that is privacy preserving. I think Bill S-210 goes too far. I actually think also it's distraction. We should be focusing on Bill C-63. There's a duty to protect children. It's not about just age verification is just one piece of the puzzle. I mean, there's a million things we should be doing to protect kids. Yeah. So let's say this passes and we create a digital safety commission. I mean, their number one priority will be how do we start building out age appropriate design codes, age appropriate measures to address the different issues that we face, and also that don't have knock-on effects on groups that, pornography is legal for adults. Yeah. The biggest problem with S-210 was it actually said, well, it's okay if the companies aren't complying, you could seek a court order that would involve removal, either blocking of entire websites, which would be more than pornography, or blocking of pornography to people who can legally access it. In my view, that's unconstitutional and should not fly.
All right. So we don't even have time to get into the rest of the bill because I've got big concerns about that too. But you seem very just, yes, I'm sure you do. That's for a whole other day. So you think we have to somehow proceed with caution, but try to get someplace with a body that will start to think about how we might manage these issues? I mean, let's not get too far down the road here and say these are the 6 rules and this is how the internet's going to operate. But to actually think through some of the issues so that we don't go through what we did with these other pieces of legislation, which were ill-conceived and ill thought out. And, we were going to save the news industry if we made Google pay money. Like it made no sense, right? And that when you get to controlling user-generated content, you got to think through what that means. It's not just generating pornography. It's people building whole businesses around, education for kids, right? Yeah. So it's just maybe just slow it down and let's think through this a piece at a time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say I was with you at the beginning and saying, yes, we need to be very cautious in anything that we build out. But I think that what has been drafted is actually a very narrow category of content. I mean, in terms of online harms, it's a small selection of sort of the big ticket items that would be within federal jurisdiction to be able to look at. Okay. So I actually think that what we need to do is proceed quickly with the study.
With that part.
Part one, we need to let's move on it. Let's start doing this really important work. But I think parts 2 and 3, the criminal code and human rights stuff that of course, we can't talk about. No, that requires much closer analysis.
Well, and that's the trouble when we've just gone through this discussion about omnibus bills, when governments do a budget and then throw everything in, including the kitchen sink. And then there's a lot of ill-conceived stuff in there. So maybe they need to hive this off as a separate issue and just deal with that and not try and say it's the whole package or none of the package, because then that makes it impossible for people like you who want to get at this issue to support, something that has more flaws and more repercussions that we then have to deal with down the road.
Yes. Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. So are you volunteering to be one of these commissioners? Didn't you chair a panel for the government on online safety?
I did chair a panel for the government. And it's certainly hard for me to stay away from this topic. I think that I just care. So it's funny how you start work in these areas. Yeah. And I started this project as I was more of a master's student at the time, right? Thinking that was kind of a big issue, and then it became a career, right? So I certainly care deeply about these kinds of frameworks and ensuring that they're done properly.
Yeah. No, and I come to this from my years in the journalism world where, free speech used to be a lot easier concept, I've got to say, before we dealt with the technology that we're dealing with today, right?
Yeah.
It was, we all have to adjust. Emily, thank you so much. Really great to meet you. And I got a feeling we're going to be back at this. We'll get at the other parts of the bill later, but let's see what happens when we all come back to work and Parliament reconvenes. Dr. Emily Laidlaw is Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law, Associate Professor at the University of Calgary, Faculty of Law. And you may want to find her book, Regulating Speech in Cyberspace, Gatekeepers, Human Rights, and Corporate Responsibility. And you were thinking about, that was 2015. That was a while ago.
Yes, and I
changed.
I started that in 2007.
Okay, it's time for an update.
Yes, you're right.
All right. Thanks so much for being with us today and really helping us I think what you've clarified, let's really narrow down what our task is here and try and focus on that. So very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Senator.
See you soon. And thank all of you for joining us today. We'll be back again soon with another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Bye for now.